Hi, I'm Dottie Rosenblum, Dorothy K. for Klawans, my maiden name, and my married name, Rosenblum. I am, at this point in time, 87 and a half years old, and the story of my life is for my children and grandchildren and great-grandchild. I started at the beginning. I was born in Chicago, Illinois, and grew up there, went to high school there, John Marshall High School, and went to college at University of Iowa for 4 years, graduated from there with a degree, a bachelor's degree in speech pathology and hearing, speech and hearing, they called it at the time. I'm sure that they've found a fancier name now. And then spent the summer after I graduated at a speech and hearing camp in a small town outside of Minneapolis, and then with a few different circumstances, was able to get a job in Omaha and working for the Omaha Public Schools. They had just expanded their speech and hearing teachers from 3 little old ladies that carried big black satchels to 5 more people. And one of the persons was a woman who had been in a couple of our classes. She had already been teaching, and she came back to get a degree in speech pathology. And she was here for, I guess, the first 2 weeks of the semester. And went home for a weekend, and her boyfriend proposed, and she didn't come back. And Don Warner, who was in charge of special education at that time, was smart enough to call the University of Iowa and Nebraska and asked if there was anybody there. And I had just called in and said the job I was going to have fell through, and we connected the dots, and they flew me out the next day and hired me, and I started the next week. At that time, we did a survey. The Office of Speech, that Special Education, was doing a survey of all of the grade schools at that time in Omaha Public Schools, so that we could locate where the possible cases were for speech therapy. And the 7 of us paired with one another, different people, different days. Whoever had cars took someone with them that didn't have a car. And it was almost that first month that it took to get all the grade schools surveyed at the time. And then the assignments were settled out. And I ended up with 3 schools in North Omaha, right off of 30th Street, because they said there was a bus line there, and I didn't have a car at the time. And the second day that I was there, I met one of the other new people who had been at University of Nebraska, and her husband was here in Omaha at the med school, and his cousin was sent to pick me up on the weekend, and 3 months later we were married. Excuse me. And so I had a contract for 5 years, and after the contract ran out, there were no available classes that I could take that I hadn't already had to renew my certificate. And it was just a teaching certificate. It wasn't specialized at the time. So I was very fortunate, and I started doing some cases on my own and going to people's houses. And I got a call one day after maybe a month or so, from Dr. Frost. I can't think of his first. Dwight Frost was his name. He was on staff at the what we now call the Med Center, and he was starting a clinic, a rehab clinic, and he needed a speech therapist, and called somebody and then called me, and I had a very part-time job there working with adults for a change instead of children. And that was really fascinating because it was a whole different, doing the same thing but with a whole different group of people. And that was for about maybe a year and a half. And then I don't know why it stopped and why I wasn't doing anything else. And then I don't even remember. About 7 years later, that would have been 1955, and then we had got our first child, adopted our first child in 1957. And it was a boy, and we named him Michael. And his sister was born 8 months later, and her name is Marcia. I'm sorry, her name is Marcia, but she's Marcy. She's been Marcy forever. And so we spent all kinds of gyrations and interviews and trying to figure out whether to start them in school at the same time. And we ended up deciding that we would keep her back. And about a week, or maybe a week or 10 days before school was starting that semester, the school called and said, we have too many children, more children than we had before, that we had signed up. And we needed her. So, not just her, but, other people, and that she was on the list for the next year. He had been to what do you call the pre-kindergarten thing in the spring, and she never got to go to kindergarten roundup. They were fortunately at a school that had 2 rooms for each grade, and were not together in grade school in the same class at the same time, nor in middle school. They had just created Westside Middle School, either the year before or 2 years before. And when they were, I think it was the last year of high school, that they were seated together, only he was at the end of one row and she was at the beginning of the next row. And at that time it was very interesting because there were 3 or 4 other siblings who were not twins that were in the same grade as my children were. And so where do we go from there? Yeah, that's 2 and 5. I want to clarify a little bit about meeting my future husband. The woman who was his cousin's wife and I, who were together for the first time, had first met each other, were when we started this new program for Omaha Public Schools in the Special Education Department. Her husband was a student at the Med Center, and the lady called me and she said that he had to study for another hour, and as soon as he was through studying, they were going out to meet his cousin, a young man, his cousin, who they were the same age, several months apart. And they were going out to have dessert, and they were sending the cousin over to pick me up where I had gotten an apartment in a private home. And that's how we met and continued to be seeing each other until getting married in December of that year. Okay, now back to my childhood. To start with my childhood now. Okay. I was born in Chicago. My father was either still an intern or a resident. I can't really remember a whole lot about that age. And we lived with my mother's parents because they did not pay residents or interns or anybody like that in those days. And so we lived, they had moved to two apartments that I remember. I don't remember any other place that we lived at that time. And but I know that I know that I started school at John Marshall Grade School, which was attached to the high school. When I was also 4.5 years old, because my birthday was in October also, and my daughter repeated the school system repeated with her entrance to kindergarten. And what else do I remember? I had a wonderful girlfriend who lived a block closer to school than I did, and I would pick her up every morning. And we would walk to school, and we would walk back to lunch, and then we would go back to school and walk back after school. And we did that from kindergarten through high school. And she married a young man who was just getting out of dental school when she met him. This was after college. She stayed in Chicago and went to college there when I was at the University of Iowa. And he was not, they were in a very, very low income neighborhood at the time. He had his apartment, was in the same building as his office, and things weren't going well. He found an ad in one of the dental magazines at the time for a very small town in southern Illinois, and went there knowing nobody and not knowing what was going to happen, and became very, very prominent in the city, and he did very, very well. And unfortunately, he passed away at the age of 42. But she stayed there and was very active. And we've seen each other occasionally at reunions, and that's about it for the last 60, 50, 40, 45, 60 years or so.
You gone to some high school reunions?
Yeah, I have gone to several of them. And my husband and the husbands of my groupies, got along very, very well. They were not bored while we were having fun. Yeah, we went to about four or five of them, I think, 4 or 5, and then I went to the last one by myself, which was the 50th reunion, and that was, of course, the best one at all, because people who had not shown up for any of the others over the years, there's this one young man who sat in front of me who was a big shot in the ROTC at the time, and did not come to any of the other ones that I had gone to. Lived in California, I believe. He was a big shot in ROTC, so I always remembered him with the uniform on, because he had to wear it most days during high school. And he and I just had the best time visiting because we always made fun of each other while we were in high school.
Were there some extracurricular activities that you enjoyed in high school?
Wasn't that kind of a thing in those days? There were some of us that were on committees, but they were more like the separate sections. And really, not a whole lot of the dances were sock hops after school, and the final, what do we call it, the final prom, the last year prom, was the only one that I went to. And I didn't have a date, and I didn't have a boyfriend, and I did have a cousin who lived in, he was from Columbus, Georgia, but he was going to a high school in Wisconsin. And I asked him if he would be my date, and he had a very good time. The other guys were really nice to him, so he didn't feel out of place, and that was that. I had a date for a high school prom. We had a group of the women, the gals. This one had different friends, and that one, it was a time when it was during World War II. There were the 4 years that I was at Marshall High, there were two other schools, one on the south of us and one on the north of us during that period, that were closing to become lecture and educational places, one for the Navy and one for the Army at that time. So we had a bunch of people 2 different times coming into our classes. It was very, very crowded. Hardly anybody had cars. There was no place to park a car. It